Good morning and welcome. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 annual lecture at the Norwegian Center for Geopolitics. My name is Ole Jakob Sending. I'm a research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, NUPI, and I'm heading up the Center for Geopolitics, which is a consortium of 5 research institutions. NUPI, the Institute for Defense Studies, the Fridtjof Nansen Institute, the University of Oslo, and UiT, the Arctic University of Norway. It is funded by the Norwegian Research Council and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I will introduce the speakers and the topic of the annual lecture, as indicated also on the screen behind me. Then Alex and Alex will give their lecture, followed by a conversation moderated by my colleague, Ren Jenny Lindgren, who's a senior researcher at NUPI. There will also be time for questions and comments from the audience. I should also note that the event is being streamed. So, we are very, very fortunate to welcome 2 scholars whose work has reshaped how we understand the global context over rules, norms, and influence. Alexander Cooley and Alexander Dukalskis. Alex Cooley is the Claire Tao Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia University, and a former director of Columbia's Harman Institute. And for the past few years, he was vice provost for Research and Academic Centers and Library at Barnard College, Columbia. His first book, Logics of Hierarchy, discussed hierarchy long before it became a thing in the study of international politics. His first major article in International Security introduced scholars to the NGO scramble and how non-state actors are integral to interstate politics. His book, co-authored with John Heddershaw, Dictators Without Borders, mapped the money networks and safe havens that sustain authoritarian elites globally. And in Exit from Hegemony, co-authored with Dan Nexon, they charted how alternative political orders erode US-led liberalism. These works show how authoritarian actors move resources, launder legitimacy, and capture different arenas once assumed to be liberal strongholds. Alexander Dukalskis is associate professor at the University College Dublin and director of UCD's Center for Asia-Pacific Research. Dukalskis' first book, The Authoritarian Public Sphere, unpacks the propaganda machine and how authoritarian regimes in North Korea, Myanmar, and China legitimate themselves domestically. In his second book, Making the World Safe for Dictatorship, he shows how authoritarian regimes invest in and seek to project positive images internationally. Now, the 2 Alexes have recently published this book, Dictating the Agenda, The Authoritarian Resurgence in World Politics. The book will form the basis for the lecture today, and the publication of their book and this lecture is, of course, unfortunately, extremely timely. Not only because they describe how authoritarian states work to counter liberal norms and institutions, but also because they detail the strategies and tactics employed to do so. So with that, I welcome them on to the stage and enjoy.
Dear friends, colleagues, thank you. Thank you, Ole Jakob. Thank you, Ren. And thank you all for being here. See some familiar faces in the crowd. And I want to thank all of the members of the Center for Geopolitics for this privilege. And yes, the world is changing, and we're trying to get a handle of it. And so we're very much looking to your feedback as well and your questions. I should also just mention on a personal note, Oslo is an important place for the Dukalskis-Cooley collaboration because it is here that me and my co-author, Alex, actually met face-to-face after working online for 3 years at a book workshop that was hosted by Nupi. So thank you for that too. So it's nice to be back here presenting some of the fruits of that research. So ordinarily, when we think about the authoritarian resurgence, usually the images that are depicted are Xi Jinping with Vladimir Putin, maybe at a summit of those two, or maybe at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, like high politics, authoritarians presenting themselves as united against the liberal West, against American dominance, hegemony, NATO, the transatlantic alliance. And certainly this is something that we can discuss and we can talk about, the high politics of authoritarian diplomacy. One of the things that we wanted to showcase in our research project, however, was how authoritarian tactics and strategies, as Ole Jakob talked about, have started to seep in and transform processes that are less obvious. Not the high politics, but really the day-to-day social and political life that we associate with global governance, that we associate with consumerism, that we associate with globalization, for lack of a better word. So in some ways, this project melts together Alex D's interest in dictatorship and the public sphere, communication strategies, contemporary authoritarianism, and my previous interest too in international order. So today we're going to talk a little bit about revisiting the 1990s, less maybe in a nostalgic way, but more in an analytical way. What did we get right and what did we get wrong, perhaps, about our assumptions about the 1990s and liberal influence? We'll talk a bit about this new geopolitical context. We'll introduce this concept that we play with in the book called authoritarian snapback in global governance. And then Alex will give you some of the top findings of our research in these areas of global media, consumer boycotts, and sport. We'll talk a little bit about the role for Norway in a changing world, right, as the country that has been at the forefront of promoting liberal order and liberal values. So let's go back to the 1990s, and we call it the long liberal 1990s, and of course this is President Bill Clinton giving one of his famous, or perhaps now infamous, lines. And this was in the context of discussing China's entry into the WTO at the time. And one of the real popular arguments that was made by analysts and academics at the time was admitting China into the World Trading Organization would change China, right? It would socialize China into playing by the rules of the liberal order. It would get buy-in into free markets, liberal logics, and perhaps inevitably encourage political liberalization too. Clinton's assumptions were widely held, and here he was also talking about what seemed to be this moment of openness facilitated by this new technology, the internet, right? And his comment sort of captured, I think this is a fleeting 18-month period in which, oh, you're trying to crack down on the internet. Good luck with that, right? It's impossible, right? There are certain technologies that are just going to sustain the world as we know it in terms of being open and accessible and so forth. So let's dive in a little further. In the book, we make the argument that this liberal influence, yes, it was premised on US hegemony, hegemonic power, the end of the Soviet Union, the Cold War sort of finally ending. All that is true, but there were two specific drivers of liberal values and liberal influence in the 1990s. One of them kind of relatively passive, a general background condition, and the other one more active. So the background condition was what's known to us as now soft power, right? This idea that the US, certain of its allies, they had the power of attraction, right? As Joseph Nye, the late Joseph Nye, sort of talked about in his book, that countries wanted to emulate the United States, certain European partners and allies, in part because of the also cultural influence that they have, be it Hollywood, popular music, images of the United States, right? Perceptions that it was an open and successful type of place. This was the background. Also, the U.S. at the time controlled much of the apparatus for demonstrating this attractiveness, right? CNN, as a global media organization, was the only global media organization that covered the 1990 Gulf War, right? In fact, this was part of their promo packages, right? That we had world leaders doing CNN commercials saying, "I stayed up all night watching the CNN," right? Again, there's a sense in which the U.S. was dictating the terms back then. The second pillar, though, was known as activism, liberal activism in transnational networks, right? That there was, beginning in the 1990s, an apparatus that was staffed by non-governmental organizations, NGOs, with like-minded allies in international organizations, in the media, in the court system, in friendly states, that were creating networks of transnational advocacy pushing for liberal values and change. Eventually, the goal usually was creating an international treaty for something and defending and universalizing the defense of rights. Political rights, rights against bodily harm, rights of equal representation, and so forth. This book here, Activists Beyond Borders, was absolutely seminal at the time. It was published in 1998 and by Margaret Catherine Sickink. And their claim in this, again, award-winning, brilliant book was that activism, transnational activism, was a powerful new third sector in global politics, right? That activists were driven neither by power, the way states were, nor by profit, the way companies were. They were a third way. And part of the argument of the book was that these actors tended to be nimble. They understood states that were very slow to react, that they could boomerang around, that they could create allies, that they could strategically pressure states, even reluctant ones, to adopt liberal norms and values, even if they didn't want to, right? So soft power on the one hand, liberal activism on the other. Just some landmark campaigns associated with liberal activism: the conventions on rights, persons with disabilities, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which became a signature liberal activist campaign, Elephant Ivory, and then here, and Alex will talk a little bit about our modern day comparison with this, the anti-sweatshop campaign of the 1990s, right, where a group of activists joined up with student groups, organized labor groups to protest the working conditions and wages of the Nike Corporation and its subcontractors across its East Asian network. And in fact, this was so effective at the time that Nike's revenue was halved in a couple of years in the 1990s, right, because of this sort of campaign. In retrospect, right, perhaps we shouldn't have been so celebratory, perhaps so naive. Perhaps we thought there was a magic sauce, right, that was in the air, that was creating this power of attraction. But I think there were three unacknowledged assumptions that we had about the 1990s and liberal influence. And we develop those in the book. The first was that much of this so-called soft power rested on efficacious authority of the United States. By this I mean US expertise, right? And an assumption that US expertise was somehow more advanced, that was somehow superior. In some ways, this was embedded in the economic and political transitions of the post-communist states of the 1990s, right? This idea that if we send technical experts from the European Union, European countries, the United States, we will teach them how to make markets, how to create legal systems, how to set up global standards and norms, how to set up a parliamentary system, political party system, right? This efficacious authority of the West was absolutely central to the technical assistance and advice for the post-communist transition. Another one was the assumption of political autonomy, right? That somehow the US and best practices in the liberal West were predicated upon institutions and actors acting in an autonomous way, even if they were supposedly non-political, that they would have the space for independent action and thought. Certainly sort of civil society was viewed that way. But even institutions, of course, courts, central banks, right? The independence of central banks at the time, this embedded autonomy became really important. And then the third was this idea of market power and Western consumer dominance. It was just assumed that the increased marketization brought by globalization would create new patterns of consumption that would align with liberal values. And in fact, when you think about the pushback against globalization in the 2000s, very rarely did we think that there would be an authoritarian pushback. Usually it was termed in terms of jihad versus Macworld, right? That there would be perhaps a religious, even a militant religious reaction against globalization, or perhaps local and regional pushbacks as globalization was destroying local cultures and values and norms, but we never really entertained the possibility that the pushback again would come from authoritarians. The two images here just illustrate some of these trends. The picture up top is the 1992 dream team of the US that won the gold medal in 1992 in the Barcelona Olympics. This was when the professional NBA athletes were first allowed to compete in the Olympics, and they had a dominant run. And there was sort of a sense here that this was the combination of the expertise of the US in basketball with staffed by the professional league that's finally being allowed to play in this international competition. The image below is iconic. Anyone know actually what this is? Gorbachev at the Pizza Hut? Yes. So Gorbachev, final Soviet premier, was actually very hard up in the 1990s. I guess once you collapse a superpower, your opportunities for media appearances aren't that plentiful. But in this case, he did an ad. Actually, that's his granddaughter for Pizza Hut. And again, this commercial became iconic, right? Gorbachev now in a new Russia enjoying a slice of Pizza Hut. Well, what happened? Well, you can see where we're going with this. Expertise has been, the perceptions of expert authority have been radically transformed. Both because of certain things that have happened in the liberal West. The great financial crisis undermined US authority over sort of financial systems and market governance. Some would argue that the events of January 6, 2021, the storming of the Capitol did the same in terms of political values, or the response to 9/11. Certainly an invasion of Iraq in 2003 was another turning point in this idea that we could promote democracy somehow by force in inhospitable areas. China's turn to the things like the Belt and Road Initiative has showcased their expertise in infrastructure development and have helped to create this counter-narrative about that China is effective in delivering things that countries and communities actually need, right? Not just sort of politics and rights, but actual bridges, tunnels, and infrastructures. Other things that we've seen is this autonomy, this idea that actors somehow have this political space has been completely eroded. On the left there, you see the graffiti, iностранный агент, foreign agent, right, of the group Memorial in Russia. And the Russians figured out pretty early on that not only could they label and stigmatize certain groups and call them agents of the US, agents of foreign influence, that doing so would have very few costs, and in the end, after the foreign agent law, they started just criminalizing these organizations. We're just going to call you undesirable and start to ban you. As it turns out, you can shut down the internet. You can do it pretty effectively. You just need the technology. The other trend that we see now is also countries like China putting pressure upon how we understand and even cover them. We can talk about the politics of academic publishing, right, and the pressures that have been put on Cambridge University Press and Oxford and so forth. A big part of our story, though, is changes in market dynamics, right? The creation of a massive consumer market in China has altered the calculation of major Western companies in terms of not only how they engage with Chinese political authorities, but also how they themselves respond to Western activism. And Alex is going to talk about that. And certainly the NBA, as it has gone global, has also run into this issue that the Chinese market is actually the biggest market for watching NBA basketball, and they have certain demands and preferences about politics. We won't show you too many stats, but this is sort of one that we wanted to get through today. In 1991, if we take the top quartile of all states, the most democratic states, right, as measured by the VDEM index, and the bottom quartile, the least democratic states. So in 1991, the era of sort of peak hegemony, the most democratic states accounted for 84% of global GDP, right? So there was no difference between consumer dominance and economic dominance and geopolitical liberal dominance, right? And the bottom 4 states only accounted for 4% of GDP. Fast forward 30 years, top 25% still have 59% of global GDP. That's pretty good, but it's not dominant. But the more important aspect, the bottom quartile states, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, are all in there, now count of 26% of GDP, right? So again, this massive market shift. Alex is going to illustrate some of this in some of our cases, but I just want to make one more comment here. In the model, we talk about this process of authoritarian snapback. What happens now when you attempt to engage as a company, as an NGO, as a philanthropic organization in an authoritarian setting? What are the sequences? And if before in the 1990s and 2000s, there was the possibility of slowly socializing a partner to engage with liberal values and norms, now we think something else is going on that's far more favorable to authoritarian hosts than before. Authoritarians have a playbook, right? They use various components of this. They learn from one another. They try out tactics. They see what works. And some of these different stages, we just want to sort of throw these out there. One might be at the beginning to stigmatize the actor. You are not an NGO. You are not an independent journalist investigating. You are not a researcher. You are actually a geopolitical actor, right? You are actually serving the interests of the United Kingdom or the US or so forth and should be treated as such, right? The stigmatization is really important. Shielding. As you stigmatize the foreign actor, because you control the media, you shield and you prepare public opinion to treat this actor as hostile or illegitimate, right? That's a different part. Reframing and engagement. It used to be that we would make arguments that, of course, we have to be involved in authoritarian settings. We must engage with them. Engagement will bring results, right? This is sort of axiomatic. It's better to engage than not to engage. But what we've seen is that engagement sometimes leads to the opposite outcome. That as Western actors and liberal actors engage with savvy authoritarian regimes, they start to make compromises, right? Certain things are off limits, certain ideas won't be talked about, certain political situations won't be mentioned, and then all of a sudden they find themselves entrapped, having sunk costs, requiring access, but unable to fully fulfill their mission and increasingly having to make compromises. At the very end, we see that the success of these tactics then projects more into the global sphere, that these are sort of copied by other countries and in sort of global arenas. And then in certain cases, authoritarian countries can start to dictate the agenda over certain issues and set the terms of the reframed rules in those ways. So I've gone on a little too long. My colleague Alex is going to give you some of these illustrations in these areas of social and political life.
Great. Well, thank you so much again. It's really wonderful to be here and to see such a wonderful turnout. So as Alex said, in the book, we identify 4 main issue areas that we unpack in more detail: global media, consumer activism and consumer boycotts, higher education, and sports. I will run you through real brief top-level findings of 3 of these issue areas, but we're happy in Q&A to unpack and discuss any of them more if you'd like. Okay. I won't go through everything in great detail, but I'll start with, wrong direction. I will start with media. And just to be clear, when we present this theoretical model of authoritarian snapback, it's not that we're arguing that authoritarians are successful in every single case in dictating the agenda or reclaiming a domain. Just like liberal activism or pro-democracy or pro-human rights activism is not successful in every case. But we argue that we see enough of a pattern that we can kind of identify a playbook that goes across these different issue areas that you might not always connect with one another. Okay? So we'll start with media. And our basic argument is that authoritarian-backed media have as one of their core objectives to first stigmatize, quote-unquote, Western media. Okay? So to present it, as Alex said, as a geopolitical tool of the West. Of course, we see this with Chinese state media calling the BBC the biased broadcast corporation, or Rwanda referring to the BBC opening a Kenya bureau as a quote-unquote soft power tank on Rwanda's doorstep. Okay? So you see that there's this first step of stigmatizing Western media kind of softens it up as a target. But also, of course, we're familiar with the logic of shielding of Western media. This is basically blocking and censorship. Okay? And I'll come to some more stats on what this looks like. But the interesting part is when you move beyond stigmatization, you move beyond shielding, you have efforts by authoritarian states to reframe global media. So in the Chinese case, for example, the foreign minister very often encourages foreign journalists to act more like Edgar Snow. For those of you who don't follow Chinese history, Edgar Snow was basically a pro-communist journalist, American journalist in the mid-20th century who really understood China. Okay? And by that, it meant he was pro-party, the Great Leap Forward wasn't a big deal, so on and so forth. Okay? And so there's an effort to reframe engagement of Western journalists and also to advance journalism in the global South by having fellowship programs and welcoming journalists from around the world to go on fellowship programs in China to have more positive coverage. The final steps of projecting control and influence outward and dictating the agenda rely on authoritarian media going global, and it really has. Okay? Both China and Russia, which are cases we look at in the book, have made massive investments in trying to make their state media apparatuses go global. So here we present some visuals on Russian state media overseas. And we see on your left, I suppose, are offices, physical offices and desks of Russian state media around the world. And we were able to find nearly 100 such offices with impressive global spread. This was before many of them were banned due to the invasion of Ukraine, which is interesting because they were allowed to operate when Russia was just an ordinary authoritarian state. But when they started being militarily aggressive, then it came time to ban them. Okay? That's on your left. On your right are content sharing agreements. And I'll say more about that in the next slide, which is the Chinese slide. What you see immediately, if we go back to Russia, you can see the Chinese spread global spread of Chinese state media is impressive by an order of 3. Okay, 3 times more offices and content sharing agreements. So extremely impressive global scope of Chinese media. We were able to find content sharing agreements between Chinese state outlets and 300 foreign outlets. Content sharing agreements are very important. Okay? When you view CGTN or Xinhua or the People's Daily, you know what it is. You know it's Chinese state media, or at least most informed consumers know it is Chinese state media. However, what Chinese state media and Russian state media have done is arrange content sharing agreements with foreign outlets, sometimes even state broadcasters or public broadcasters in foreign countries, to share content, to run content from Xinhua or from TASS, which is the Russian equivalent, in local outlets. And what that means is that you open your local newspaper or website or whatever, and you're confronted with Chinese or Russian state propaganda without even necessarily knowing it. Okay? This is not such a huge issue in Western Europe and the United States because there's outlets like Reuters or AFP or the AP. But in contexts in which finances are strapped, Xinhua or TASS is offered much cheaper and sometimes even for free. Okay? And what does this do is it gets the pro-authoritarian narrative into media outlets that it otherwise might not have access to. It frames issues in particular ways and perhaps even more importantly, keeps certain issues off the agenda altogether. Okay? You can see on your left, yes, we were able to find these are the local outlets of Xinhua and CGTN. And on your right are the content sharing agreements. Okay, so this is kind of the pro-authoritarian global media push, but this comes with a flip side, and that is restrictions on information that comes out of authoritarian states. So this is restrictions on foreign correspondents, foreign journalists, often from liberal democratic states, restrictions on them covering the authoritarian state itself. Okay, and there are many scholars and activist organizations who gather information on physical assaults of journalists, and this is obviously, extremely important and unnerving. We took a different approach, which was to gather data on administrative restrictions on foreign journalists. So these capture instances in which, in theory or on paper, a state is open to foreign journalists coming to investigate and to do their work. But in practice, their work is so frustrated and manipulated that it becomes difficult for them to do their work. Okay? So from 1999 to 2023, we try, to the best of our ability, to capture instances in which authoritarian states restricted the work of foreign journalists, foreign correspondents. And you can see a few interesting statistics here. The first is that the most common strategies is to simply deny visa or reaccreditation to the journalists or to deport them, basically. Okay? So this uses the technologies of sovereignty, the ability to issue visas and passports and access to restrict journalistic inquiry domestically. You can see here on your right the top 10, I guess, most active users of these practices of restricting foreign journalists. And it's some you would expect: Russia, Azerbaijan, China. But then what sticks out to me on this list is that it's all regions, it's different authoritarian regime types, personalist, single party, monarchy, so on and so forth. To me, this suggests that these norms of these emerging counter norms of restricting journalistic access. It's not a cultural thing. It's not a historical thing. It's about authoritarianism, really, right? Given that it spans those different categories. Okay, consumer activism. So Alex mentioned briefly the 1990s consumer activism surrounding sweatshop labor in particularly in Nike factories, Nike subcontracted factories. I want to show you a case of consumer activism more recently, specifically from 2017 to 2022. Those of you familiar with the context will know that the Chinese government has launched a crackdown starting in around 2014 on its Uyghur ethnic minority in Xinjiang in its western region. Starting in 2017, the campaign evolved into a program of mass internment. Over time, it became clear that this program was related to and somehow involved in forced labor, particularly in the cotton industry in Xinjiang. Okay. Cotton harvesting and labor standards in the textile industry became especially central in these debates because roughly 85% of China's cotton comes from Xinjiang and roughly 20% of global supply. So this is a major industry for global fashion and clothing. Okay. The development of this forced labor system stoked transnational activism, ultimately resulting in some regulatory changes in the United States and Europe to prevent, in theory, forced labor in the cotton supply chain. Happy to talk about more details about any elements of the case, but I want to talk about the snapback from China. Okay. What you had is that Western clothing brands, most notably and visibly H&M, okay, and an industry certification group called the Better Cotton Initiative became ensnared in this snapback. Basically, the idea was H&M and Better Cotton Initiative in 2020 and a little bit before expressed reservations about certifying cotton as free from forced labor if it was in Xinjiang. Okay? H&M said it was no longer going to source cotton from the region on forced labor, on grounds of concerns over forced labor. What you saw is that for about 6 months or 9 months, nobody really paid attention to that. Okay? It was basically quiet. And then March 2021, the European Union, in conjunction with some other, with the US and Canada, put sanctions on some Chinese officials for human rights abuses in Xinjiang. China responded the next day with not only counter-sanctions on some European actors, but also a vociferous nationalistic boycott and campaign against H&M and the Better Cotton Initiative. Okay? So tweets and corporate statements from H&M were resurrected from the previous year to basically try to force these companies into either making apologies for not using Xinjiang cotton, or to suggest that they're somehow hurting the feelings of the Chinese people for criticizing forced labor in Xinjiang. Okay? So the government, we have each step of the snapback listed here. The government stigmatized those who were identifying and researching the forced labor system in Xinjiang. Okay? They shielded the domestic audience from companies that had committed to not using Xinjiang cotton anymore. So H&M, for example, was expunged from mapping software in China. A television show here blurred out. I mean, there's a normal television show, but then the fashion brands were blurred out because they were allegedly hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. You then saw reframing engagement. Basically, a nationalistic campaign was making the argument that if you want to do business in China, you need to follow Chinese rules. And Chinese rules are that Xinjiang cotton does not use forced labor, that forced labor is a fabrication, basically, of the West. Okay? So you need to abide by our rules. Okay? And then projecting control and influence outward, the Better Cotton Initiative, a transnational industry group that certifies cotton standards on various metrics, basically went silent on its engagement with China. So it has, to my knowledge, not spoken about this episode subsequently. Okay? And even more recently, you see China attempting to have promote its own global cotton standards. Okay? So not an industry certification group, but rather a different basically pro-Xinjiang cotton standard for global companies. Okay. Very briefly, I will talk about sports, global sports. So we're probably familiar with this idea of sports washing, okay? The idea that authoritarian states hold mega events in order to kind of distract from their human rights abuses. And this happens, okay? So we're not saying sports washing doesn't happen. We just think it's kind of more interesting than that. That actually what we are seeing is that authoritarian states are investing in global sports in ways that many of us don't necessarily see, but that are influencing political activism and political speech of teams, sports leagues, and sporting federations. Okay? In the book, we contrast the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics with the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. And we argue that in 2008, there was an enormous liberal human rights campaign to pressure China to change its human rights practices. Okay? And it met with some success, not overwhelming, but some tactical success here and there. There was some loosening on press restrictions in China after 2000, in the lead up and after 2008, for example. Okay? But more importantly, China felt the need in 2008 to speak the language of human rights, to at least pretend that it was playing by some kind of human rights global standards. Fast forward to 2022, and there was an attempted boycott on the Chinese Winter Olympics that basically fell flat entirely. And China was able to easily parry any kind of pressure from activist groups or from liberal democratic governments, okay? Beyond mega events, we try to capture the ways in which authoritarian financing of sports clubs, leagues, and federations are transforming sports from a domain in which political activism was tolerated or even encouraged to one in which it's strongly discouraged or sometimes even prohibited. So we present some stats on major ownership of major European football clubs, and interestingly, investments by Saudi Arabia in all kinds of different sports, okay? The dark bars show investments, active sponsorships of Saudi's public investment funds in sports leagues in 2021, and the light gray in 2023. So in the space of only 2 years, this kind of sports investment by Saudi Arabia's public investment fund has just skyrocketed in remarkable ways. And what effect has this had? Well, a manifestation of this that we explore in the book is discouraging of political speech, and in fact now even sometimes speech codes in sporting federations, so that athletes are strongly discouraged or even prohibited from advancing their political viewpoints. The basic argument is that as authoritarian financing and the market power of authoritarian sports fans has gone global, so have explicit and implicit restrictions on political speech by athletes and other personnel. We see this across all kinds of different sports. The National Basketball Association and its disputes with China, Formula One and its strong engagement now with Gulf states, okay? The Qatar World Cup in 2022, and the controversy around European teams having an armband that supported LGBTQ+ rights. Ultimately, the sporting federation, FIFA, determined that players would receive a yellow card on the pitch if they wore the armbands. Live Golf and the PGA Golf in the United States, for those of you who are golf fans, are now exploring a merger that reportedly includes a non-disparagement clause of Saudi Arabia. Okay? And so we're seeing these sports investments transforming the engagement of political actors with sports. I'll leave you with two sets of thoughts. Okay? One is what's happening in the United States, and one is relevant to Norway. So the United States, we've made it, by my count, 38 minutes without mentioning Donald Trump. But we do have to we do have to talk about the guy. Our basic, our book went to press in November 2024. Went to like layout in 2024. So we couldn't change much, basically. We tried to make some insertions here and there, but it's not a Trump book. The trends we identify predate Trump. They will outlive Trump. Okay. What we do see, though, since the book went to press, is that Trump has accelerated the dynamics that we identify. Okay, and he's, I think, accelerated them in three main ways. One is undermining liberalism by example, basically at home. Okay, so I don't need to tell you about everything that's going on in the United States, but that weakens many of those steps weaken the image of democracy globally. Okay, so it degrades the United States as an example of liberal democracy. Okay, the second is that the government has been undermining the organizational infrastructure of democracy promotion. So the shutting down of US aid and other programs were important for obviously humanitarian reasons, but also for democracy promotion reasons. So media outlets, NGO groups got some of their funding from US aid, okay, around the world. Now, some of them will be able to pivot and recoup some of that funding from elsewhere or change their strategies, but there's no doubt that some will close, and it put a lot of them in a tough spot. Okay. The third is that the Trump administration has been undermining efforts to fight kleptocracy and corruption, which thrives in authoritarian conditions of low transparency. Okay? So that's the United States part. Now, what does all this mean for Norway? Like, far be it from me to come here and tell you what Norway should do. But I live in Ireland, based in Ireland, so I think about this from the point of view of small, liberal, democratic European states committed to liberal democracy and peace. So what can states like that do? And what I think is, there are a few, and I would love to explore them more in Q&A, but one is to understand that there are trade-offs in global engagement, that there will be tensions between particularly authoritarian linked financing of institutions and networks and political speech. And so to go into those kinds of global engagements with eyes open and to understand how to mitigate the potential for political fallout. The second is to not assume that the liberal international system will sustain itself. So to sustain and build coalitions of like-minded democratic states in order to amplify the power of liberal democracy collectively. And third is to make investments to underwrite liberalism at home in terms of media, universities, education, of course the political system itself, but even resources permitting, perhaps relevant to Norway, sustaining liberalism abroad, okay? Again, through media, transnational media outlets, through democracy promotion programs and the like. So I'll leave it there, and I believe the next slide is the newsletter slide, so please sign up for the newsletter of this organization. So thank you, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Well, thank you so much, Alex and Alex, for sharing some of your snapback snippets with us from your book, a really important, timely contribution to understanding how authoritarian regimes are shaping global governance and what's new here. And like you say, you're taking the focus away from some of the central issue areas and bringing in some of the other stories that maybe we don't hear about so much. So very important and timely contribution. Here is the one book we have in the room, so on display. This book was just published a couple weeks ago, so it's very fresh off the press. So I was hoping we could have a conversation about some of the topics that you've touched on, but also expanding on some others that are in this book that we didn't have a chance to cover yet. And the first topic that I think would be meaningful to discuss is this idea of authoritarian interconnectedness, which you mention a few times in your book. And in some cases, we see more pronounced coordination now between authoritarian regimes when it comes to countering the liberal world order and really repurposing these important liberal networks. One of the most referenced examples, of course, is this interconnectedness between China and Russia, where we've seen a number of defense agreements, economic ties strengthening. We see a lot of the high politics aspect, right? The summitry, the parades, not the focus of your book, as you say, right? You're looking really at the globalization aspect and the transnational networks, but still of great importance in understanding how this plays back into the authoritarian snapback. So I'm wondering if you could explain to us why this authoritarian interconnectedness is happening now. Yeah. What is bringing this about? And then also, the second piece of this, you discuss many other authoritarian powers in your book. Is there some variation in the way that authoritarian powers want to interconnect or how they go about doing this?
Yeah, so thank you for those important questions. I think the first thing to realize is that this is happening at multiple levels, right? And there is the high politics level, the summitry, which is important. Regional organizations are important. The repurposing of regional security agreements, right, to identify political dissidents and oppositional movements as threats. So, you know, we can look at something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the Gulf Cooperation Council, and we can say, well, on the one hand, they are security organizations, right? Who's the security threat? Right? And so when you look at something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's watchdog list, right, they have a list of terrorist, extremist, and separatist organizations, about 40 of them, and a list of over a couple of thousand individuals put on that list. And basically what happens is every member state designates their own political dissident or security threat, and the others recognize it, right? So part of it is using this infrastructure, right, to define political opposition as security threat, right, the securitization of political authority. So that's happening at the high politics level. At the same time, there is this engagement with the globalization infrastructure, and this is where we're part of the story, right? A lot of Western actors are active participants in this. Now, they're not doing anything illegal, right? Alex has done some really amazing work with other colleagues on the role of public relations, right, firms in the US representing authoritarian states, right? But the global services that we have, right, including tracking software, right, that's openly available on the international market, right? You mentioned kleptocracy, right, the role of private wealth managers, right? The role of, say, the American Bar Association, right, in sort of like lobbying for adhering to certain privacy rules, right? Pushing back against registries of beneficial ownership. In other words, there is an apparatus of service providers that are involved in their profession, and certainly they're taking contracts. Many of these engagements are lucrative, and again, they're not doing anything that's expressly illegal, but they have created a transnational infrastructure, right, that does burnish the reputation of authoritarians and then allows them, very importantly, to move money. And this is the kleptocracy bit that Alex was talking about, right? Turning money that is vulnerable in the home country, if there's a change in government or the ruling family gets kicked out, turning them into legitimate assets that can be protected overseas. So I think we have to look at the high politics and the behind the scenes as part of a single apparatus. They're doing different things, right? And so I don't think focusing on one or the other gives us the full picture.
Can I jump in?
Please.
Yeah, I want to say two things. One is, I agree with everything he just said.
We get along so well. Right?
He's very smart.
Yes.
No, the other, I would say, to your question about different strategies.
Yeah.
I think each state, we don't argue that there's some authoritarian master plan, that they're sitting in a room and trying to manipulate the rest of us, but that they watch and learn from one another, and that they're very adept at trying things, and if they don't work, trying something else, and looking for points of leverage. And each state is going to have different points of leverage, okay, or different strengths. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular, have their sovereign wealth fund. That is an enormous tool that they can use to advance their viewpoints. China has a huge market. Okay, so that's a different kind of tool that can be used. A small state like Rwanda doesn't have the market, doesn't have the public investment fund, but it does have, paradoxically enough, aid. And it knows that Western donors perceive Rwanda as a success story. And so it can use that as leverage to parry pressure to enact liberal democratic reforms.
Great, thank you. I wanted to continue a little bit on the same theme, but relate it more to the responses to democracy promotion from authoritarian regimes, because this is how you open your book, really, right? You tell the tale of Chinese and Russian responses, especially to American democracy promotion in the form of President Biden's Summit for Democracy, which was established first in 2021. I think it had only 3 iterations, which the last being in 2024. And you explain how both China and Russia responded to this very critically in quite interesting ways, right? You say that China has perceived this as problematic. It's accusing of excessive democracy, democracy deficit, fading democracy, and it lauded their own system, which they referred to as a democracy that works. Russia was also very critical, accusing the US of imposing rules and also doing this from a non-inclusive body. So we see here that the threat perception focus is shifting from the authoritarians to the democracy promoters. And I wonder if in your research you have found any kind of evidence in terms of the effectiveness of actually engaging with these kinds of narratives and responding to them, if the pushback of liberal states is only potentially feeding into this snapback mechanism that you propose. What should we do in terms of engaging, or should we not be engaging with this kind of criticism?
So it's a super interesting, very important question. I think the strategies depend on whether we're talking about governments or corporations or with different sort of levels of exposure in their portfolio. But I'll give a couple of examples. I think the Summit for Democracy, while well-intentioned, was a mistake. part of the reason I think was a mistake was that it actually turned some of the strengths of democratic systems into sort of liabilities, especially this whole designation, well, who gets invited, right? That became the issue. Well, why are you inviting this state and this state? Like, who are you to tell us we're not a democracy, right? It became so much about that the actual substance of what the Biden people were trying to do was overlooked. And it offered then this opportunity for Moscow and Beijing to roll their eyes, right? And in a strange, I don't want to overdo the analogy, but I got late Warsaw Pact vibes from that, right? That we were the ones sort of clinging to this sort of notion like summit, summit for democracy, and then the others in opposition were kind of, the dynamic ones, right? Running sort of circles around. I think, and I've been at this in terms of the non-for-profit part of it, sort of advising and involved in the works of different sort of liberal organizations for a few decades. I would say the single biggest mistake made by philanthropic organizations that were very well-intentioned, that wanted to support civic engagement and activism, is some of them, and I won't mention specific names, when first confronted with these counter tactics, they made a conscious and intentional decision to ignore them, right? When they were stigmatized in the press, when they were, all these sort of conspiracy theories came online, then on social media, the leadership of these organizations said, we are not going to roll in the mud with them. We are going to do our work. We're going to support citizens' movements who are, interested in sort of combating local corruption or independent media, right? We're going to do what we do, and they can sort of, our actions will speak louder than stigmatization. It doesn't work that way. If you don't respond, you are tarnished. You are stigmatized. That was the biggest mistake. To the point now where we see these tactics now in the US, right? We're going to call everyone Antifa, however you want to pronounce it, right? And there's no room for nuance here. There's no room for, oh, but actually what our group does is so-and-so. So I think the contestation part is something that we didn't understand, in part because we just assumed that the actions, right, would speak for themselves, and it just doesn't work that way.
I'll leave it.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, great. As you mentioned before, you finished drafting this book in November 2024, right on the heels of the re-election of President Trump. And Alex D., you've already given us some ideas about how we can reflect on this. I wanted to ask a bit about a specific field that you are both, of course, naturally involved in, and that you also cover in the book, but that we haven't covered in the presentation, that has become very politicized, and that is higher education. I'll take say what you want to what you want to say here, but clearly during the past 10 months of the Trump 2.0 administration, higher education has become very politicized. It's no longer on the periphery, and so it maybe is moving into this core issue area when it comes to the topics that you reflected on. So I'm wondering what you could provide in terms of some insight into that case, which isn't covered here, also reflecting on the great detail you have in the book, and also how much this Trump 2.0 administration actually fits, how much does his playbook fit this snapback mechanism that you propose?
I'll start on higher education. So in the book, we talk about how Western universities expanding internationally, partly due to underfunding of their operations at home. They were basically compelled to internationalize, to get foreign students, to open foreign branch campuses as revenue streams. Okay. Now, we're not arguing against internationalization. Obviously, we like international academic collaborations. But what we saw is that as universities globalized, they ignored the politics, essentially, or they had wishful thinking that the politics wouldn't impact on their own operations. So what you saw first is that universities, branch campuses, and international engagements became subject to authoritarian norms and rules. And eventually what you see now is that not only are branch campuses of Western universities subject to increasing controls in the branch campus, but that it's influencing policies and practices on the home campus in the liberal democracy. So the question about, will go open this university and change that other place? Well, now it seems like, at least in some degree, the influence is running the other direction through that relationship. Okay? With regard to Trump specifically, yes, we see a lot of these tactics being deployed domestically. I'm not an administrator at a university, so I don't speak, I'm not speaking for any university or any institution here. But it certainly seems that understanding the playbook of stigmatizing professors and scholarship, using unrepresentative cases to tarnish universities as bastions of, Marxist indoctrination or whatever it is. I mean, professors can't even get students to read the syllabus. Like, we can't indoctrinate people, right? And increasingly having administrative pressure brought to bear on major universities in the United States. The one thing I would say, and this is still unfolding, is that I think universities had scope to stand up and resist sooner and more vociferously, particularly universities that are very well resourced. They get obviously the lion's share of the attention in these debates. But for every, Harvard or something, there are 100 universities in the United States that don't have the funding to do what those bigger universities could have the wherewithal to do. It would be painful and difficult and of course, come with some costs. But I think universities had scope to stand up more, to prevent this full sequence that we identify from playing out.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things as someone who's just come out of the battles of some administrative entanglements. A couple of things that perhaps you don't see in the headlines. One is, I think amongst the elite private higher educational institutions, there was a sense that this couldn't actually happen to them or apply to them because they were private. And I remember when this started happening in certain states, right? The crackdown in, say, Florida or Texas, the interference. Where was the solidarity then, right? It was non-existent. And instead, a lot of universities, my own included, we're getting these great job applicants from Florida, right? There was a sense that we saw this as an opportunity. There wasn't solidarity expressed, right? Because we didn't think it necessarily applied to us because we weren't dependent on state funding, yeah? As it turns out, right, not only did the federal government actually learn from places like Hungary, but also, even if you're private, there are so many levers that the federal government controls. They control research funding. They control stipulations to research funding, right? They control the ability of foreign students, right, to come in and out. And foreign students, international students, make up a majority of many of our schools and our programs, right? So there are numerous levers, and that's even before we get into the public relations kind of dynamics here, right? Because the political support for private higher education in the US is pretty low at the moment. So all of these tactics were successful, but I think we overestimated how truly independent we were. Because at the end of the day, there's so many of aspects of social and political life associated with the university that the federal government can influence.
A topic that we often cover in geopol seminars and other lectures is the topic of the multilateral system, an extremely important system for the liberal small state you find yourself in today.
Yeah.
So I wanted to touch on that briefly. There's a sense, of course, that the multilateral system is becoming more fragmented, and we see more and more in focus on perhaps regional constellations. In various parts of your books, you discuss how authoritarian powers are influencing the multilateral system, international organizations. We haven't covered that so much here, but how much they really focus on advancing illiberal norms in specific arenas. And so I wanted to ask what you think the implications of this are for the multilateral system. And if I can, looking at the clock, just tag on the issue of what the implications are for advocacy as well, because this is a hugely important topic. You know, as we traditionally know advocacy, is it dead? Is that model no longer?
Yeah, those are both great questions. So two general points. One is that the multilateral system is now a center of contestation, just like every other political arena is, right? We used to make distinctions between high politics, right, of diplomacy and global governance, and domestic politics. That distinction doesn't effectively exist anymore. Certainly doesn't exist for this American administration, right? This idea that there was a bipartisan, no. There's this political contestation over values, over what direction the country is going, over national identity, questions about religion, immigration, the family, right? All of these things are now global, regional, transnational, national, subnational, right? So we have to understand that the multilateral arena is an arena for that, right? It can no longer be assumed that it is disseminating certain norms and values. And in fact, the norms of, you know, democracy, of anti-corruption, of women's rights, right? That all these norms can be reconstituted and reflected in different ways, even if that's the purpose of the mission, right? So I think there's a mindset of that we need to switch to one of sort of contestation as opposed to upholding a mythical mission that itself is being sort of like changed. That's number one. Two, rules. Rules of these organizations are so important, right? Chinese figured this out really early on, right? Who controls the committees? Who controls the agenda? Who gets to populate the agenda, the scheduling? Who gets to decide which external groups come in and give testimony? That these kind of basic infrastructural things of multilateral governance are incredibly important. Again, China has been at the forefront of sort of, you know, restricting designations of which types of civil society groups have UN status and which ones don't. So we really need to concern ourselves with these. They don't make headlines necessarily. They're not going to be, you know, the top level political speeches, but the actual infrastructure from the bottom up of how we conduct business and multilateralism that needs to be paid attention to more.
I'm curious to hear from the audience.
Yes, I think we will now very shortly open for questions. One final quick question to you both. In your conclusion, you talk about the agenda ahead, some topics we should be on the lookout for: AI, greenwashing, gender washing. Yeah. What else should we be prepared for if this authoritarian tendency continues in the coming years and decades?
Yeah.
Beyond those three, I mean, those are three pretty meaty ones already.
You can just say those three.
Those three. Yeah, I think we'll leave it there. And then
okay.
Yeah. Well, that's yeah. I think like everything. But
that was my inclination as well. Everything.
Everything. Okay. Yeah. Greenwashing, gender washing, AI. Yeah. Maybe we'll have some follow-up questions.
Yeah. No. To me, if we were to pick all of those, to me, really the most important one in terms of making investments really is media coverage, right? Media coverage determines how we think about gender washing, or greenwashing, or how we cover the COP, or how we cover Rwandan parliamentary elections, right? Instead of giving sort of prizes for sort of women's leadership, we should be questioning what is the role of having a two-thirds female parliament in a political system like this, right? So media itself is really important, and this is where we see this dynamic of Western retrenchment from global media coverage and authoritarian investments in global media coverage. So I'll give that final piece of advice.
Thank you so much. Great. Now we would like to open the room for questions from the audience. When you pose your question, it would be excellent if you could also please identify yourself. There is a microphone that will go around the room, and we'll take questions in a few bunches. So please raise your hand and indicate that you're interested in asking something to Alex and Alex. Okay.
Hello, my name is Tove Gravdal. I'm a journalist. And talking about the media, there's a question of how we react to those structures that you have so well described to us. It's really, really interesting. And one particular example is President Macron, when Vladimir Putin visited him, and they had this press conference at the Versailles, and Macron prohibited Sputnik and Russia Today to attend the press conference. And Putin was obviously offended, but this has been a debate here in Norway as well, whether we should prohibit those outlets in Norway. Is that a proper reaction? And also you asked for reactions. We shouldn't stay silent when media or NGOs are stigmatized. How should the media react then in the United States when they are continuously stigmatized by the democratically elected president?
Yeah.
Great. We'll gather a couple more.
Those are great questions.
Yeah. Was it Bjørnar? Did you have a question? Or Benedicte? Right?
Bjørnar Sverre-Tygeson, Institute for Defense Studies. You kind of touched upon it at various points in your excellent presentation, but I was curious, because this authoritarian snapback in media, of course, happens coincidentally at the same time as media itself is being revolutionized at a really historical level. I mean, do you find that this restructuring of media has been a boon for authoritarians in this snapback, or, as Bill Clinton probably would have said, the opposite? Given, I mean, we're in the House of Literature now, and I just read that book sales in Norway are down by half this last year because people are getting the information from TikTok instead. But I'm sure your book will buck the trend, so that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you. My name is Benedicte Bull. I work at the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Oslo. I will sneak in 2 questions. One is if you could say something more about sort of the root of this authoritarian snapback, because there's at least 2 broad narratives on that. One is that this is inevitable. It's planned from the Chinese centuries back. It's kind of a historical process. The other is that this is something that could have been avoided. It is also about the Western policy. It's about sanctions, excluding countries and actors from global markets, etc. So I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. And then on what you said about sort of how to confront this, on the creation of coalitions of like-minded countries. That is a good idea, but it's also extremely complicated because it appears that countries kind of, not only governments are changing, but national identities. So sort of a country that is a like-minded country one year can be a non-like-minded country just with an election. So if you could say a few more words about that. Thank you.
I think we'll start with those some great questions.
Maybe I'll start.
Yeah,
and
you start.
pick up. Yeah. So on media, thank you so much for asking that question. So one of the recommendations we make in the book, and it's a difficult one sometimes to put in practice, is to resist the urge to use authoritarian methods to fight authoritarianism. I don't know how, we haven't talked about it, I don't know how you feel about it, but I'm a little ambivalent about the banning of RT in Europe after the war. I understand the logic, and I certainly sympathize with it, but I wonder about what benefit it really brought. RT was a relatively marginal outlet in the first place at the time, with some exceptions maybe in neighboring states to Russia, right? But certainly in a place like Ireland, not many people were watching it. So my approach would have been a little bit more less banning and more transparency, so labeling it as state-backed media, alerting consumers to the idea that this is basically a propaganda outlet. To me, that might be a better approach to start rather than banning. I think part of the reason for that is that if you get into a tit-for-tat with an authoritarian actor, you're never going to win. They're always going to out-authoritarian you by banning more or escalating to violence quicker or other methods. Part of the reason, incidentally, so the US and China have this dynamic with journalists all the time. Okay, China will ban journalists from the New York Times or Wall Street Journal or whatever, private outlets from China, and the U.S. will respond by banning or decertifying Xinhua journalists from Xinhua. The little bit of a tricky dynamic there is that Xinhua journalists are also, so Xinhua has an internal reporting system to the leadership. So they write reports about social trends. I mean, it's kind of open source intelligence gathering, right, for the leadership. So there's a little bit of an asymmetrical dynamic there as well. But what that means is that the Chinese side also sees journalists as intelligence gatherers, even though they're not, even though they're journalists. And so there's sometimes a misperception there that again leads to China banning those journalists. On the root causes of this, so we argue that rising authoritarian powers and global interconnectedness are the two root causes of these authoritarian snapbacks. But you mentioned the very convincing idea that the West has made some blunders along the way in accelerating or abetting the snapback. So the two that come to mind immediately are, well, three really. Overreach, security overreach after September 11th, the invasion of Iraq on grounds of democracy promotion was a major catastrophic blunder for a variety of reasons, but also for tarnishing democracy promotion as a project, and the Western financial crash damaged faith in the economic system. So none of that was inevitable, I don't think, but it was facilitated by, to some degree, a lack of reflective thinking about what was happening at the time.
Yeah, I think on media, I'll just add that one transformative and important development is now the role of Silicon Valley, right, in sort of the tech sector and the kind of appropriation of the language of free speech, right, to sort of try and dismantle any kinds of responsibility about content moderation and things like that. And in the States, of course, we have the First Amendment, and we haven't done a very good job explaining like why this is necessary, right, and why this is so sort of integral to sort of the polity and social cohesion, and that part I'm really concerned about that, because we don't have the same sort of traditions that you do here about holding the platforms themselves responsible for what they put out. But that's happening right now. I think I'll take the questions about coalitions and advocacy in times like this, and thank you for that. Yes, what do you do in cases where an election puts a state on the opposite side of an issue that you assumed at some point there would be support? I think we need to, and I think many groups are doing this, rethink the ultimate end goal of a lot of this advocacy. We've been very focused on international treaties, the UN system, and that once we sort of get that, then the job is done. And in fact, what we see now is a world of multiple standards, multiple kinds of definitions of sort of end goals. The Xinjiang Cotton is a good example. And so I think part of the target of strategic advocacy, strategic litigation, is to fight for what we consider to be the better version of these multiple things, and why that is. And then a tactical piece of advice. With what is happening in many liberal democratic countries in the West, and I think there is a natural affinity between sort of the kind of post-liberal challengers, right, within the West, and some authoritarians and authoritarian tactics, comes an opportunity. And that opportunity is to actually actively involve new coalitions, including in the Global South, and have us learn from them, right? How did you handle, say, as a public health school, I'm sort of thinking about sort of transnational education, a hostile government in Brazil that didn't believe in public health, right? What tactics did you use? Right? In other words, it creates new spaces for active learning in a way that also breaks free from, we are sort of instructing you, this is how we do things, right? And it breaks from that dynamic, and actually I think it's sort of very beneficial for us to understand what worked and what didn't in which situations. And this is something I'm trying to encourage my colleagues in academia to do more of, is to have sessions with colleagues in law schools in India or in Turkey, public health in Brazil, to sort of, you really understand that, you know, this, you're being politically challenged. Yes, it's shocking, and maybe it's disturbing, but, you know, buckle up. This is what most of the world deals with. And so let's learn from one another, and let's acknowledge the new rules of the game, and let's set perhaps, you know, different sort of goals that are important as interventions, but not just always assume that the end goal is always getting to the global treaty or the global understanding of something.
Great. We would like to have one more round of questions before we close. We'll gather a few. Yes?
Thank you. Sigurd Falkenberg Mikkelsen, Norwegian Broadcasting. I shall avoid asking a media question, even though I have tons here. But I was thinking about sports washing and authoritarian politics when I saw Gianni Infantino on stage in the Middle East Trump Peace Summit. I think it's a first, but could you please give a comment on how you see also these big organizations and how they evolve, and how world politics is evolving with them?
Yes, indeed. It's an important obseration. Oh, sorry.
Maybe we'll just gather one more question in interest of.
Sorry, I wanted to jump into FIFA politics.
It's tempting.
Matthew Blackburn, NUPI. Thank you very much for this talk. It was fascinating. My question is, if you could maybe push back on an alternative explanation that's been ringing around in my head and other people for many years about these developments that you describe in your book, namely that the 1990s produced a powerful expectation of liberalism as an ideology that would spread over the globe, democratization and modernization that would now has been kind of come unstuck because of these bad actors, these authoritarians, which is one way of framing this. But the other way of framing it is that ideology is only one factor that motivates state behavior. The other two are the kind of brick walls that liberalism has hit, namely realism as a factor of motivating state elites and state governments, great power interests or whatever, and nationalism, which, you know, kind of is in how I read your kind of your snapback. It's not per se authoritarianism. It's about realism and nationalism as these kind of things that you'll find in India and Turkey and in Egypt and other countries that may or may not be authoritarian. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Yes. Let's address those two questions.
Yes. So let me start with FIFA. Of course, you know, Infantino was brought in the legacy of a different FIFA scandal, right? Which was the FIFA corruption scandal, in terms of, you know, the bribes allegedly sort of given across the federations. That was something that U.S. Department of Justice, actually James Comey, was at the center of that investigation, right? It's something also that Vladimir Putin commented on. I think it was sort of 10 years ago. Like, who is the U.S. to sort of indict and judge and prosecute, right, this sort of international organization over? So the terms of that have shifted dramatically. Let's just say that. I find this quite strange, quite disturbing in some ways, right? I don't think it serves the Federation well. It's understandable that they want to maintain productive and engaged ties with the host country, but we don't see Infantino hanging out in Mexico City, right, or in Ottawa in the same way, right, even though Mexico and Canada are co-hosts. I think this was a point that was made in the New York Times. And, you know, I think these federations, right, really have a responsibility to at least do no harm, right, and set the terms of, you know, what is to be sort of expected in this sort of global spectacle. And so if you're going to involve yourself, right, in the politics and this overt domestic political support of the host country, then you're also on the hook for policies that the domestic host country engages in that might not be as welcoming, right, or supportive of the event that's being hosted, right? So is Infantino going to comment upon types of border policies, right, that might affect the ability of sort of foreign fans to travel, right? We would sort of expect that. So I think this partial engagement is very necessary, is very disturbing, and it leaves you sort of exposed to, well, if you're promoting your values, then you have like a responsibility to bring up and raise issues on all sides of the game. It does seem to me, I'll make one more comment about Trump on this. Trump is going to be presiding over the 2026 FIFA Men's World Cup and the 2028 Summer Olympics. And he clearly sees both of these events, and he's commented them on, as opportunities for him to, as prestige events for him, his administration, his status. And so I think this is something that other countries, federations need to think about, that corporate sponsors need to think about too, sort of being implicated in what's coming. And I actually think of the different issue areas that we looked at. Sport to me is one in which the opportunities for sort of political expression are closing at a much more rapid rate.
Not only that, yesterday Trump apparently kind of dangled out the threat of removing World Cup games from Boston
Right.
because he doesn't like the mayor.
Yeah.
Right. So she's a Democrat, and so it's an attempt not only as a prestige event, but to use it as a political weapon at home, potentially. An interesting part of the sports kind of FIFA world that occurred over the summer was, of course, the Club World Cup in the United States, which is FIFA's new project to have more games. And it was financially in a tough spot only weeks before the event because there wasn't that much interest. It's hot in the United States in the summer. Fans don't want to go. There were a bunch of clubs fans hadn't heard of or weren't familiar with, so the tickets weren't selling. So what happens a week before the event's due to begin? But through a streaming company, the Saudi Public Investment Fund pledges $1 billion of financing for prize money and the like. And so, again, this isn't something that someone like Trump is talking about and making a big public thing about, but it undergirds this entire system in ways that the average observer, the average sports fan, might not see or appreciate.
Yeah. Actually, I realize I didn't respond to Matthew's really important question about sovereignty and nationalism and realism. I would perhaps, I think you're right. I think these are important in their own rights. I mean, I think authoritarians, though, strategically deploy, nationalism in this pushback, right? And I think, especially this question, I see it sort of in the case of the U.S., well, we're not liberals, we're realists, but this isn't realist behavior, right? Like, great powers maximizing sort of national interests don't just unilaterally cut off their foreign aid arm, right? Like, because this is something that's deployed strategically. Even if you don't actually believe in the values, right, you do this to have leverage, to create sort of side payments, to create sort of networks of associations. So I actually don't think in the U.S. case at the moment, this is about great power behavior. It's about some other things. That's one. But I think there is a common playbook where you push back against international norms and opprobrium, and then you code it as external interference, right? So the production of sovereignty, right, is itself a sort of domestic authoritarian tactic that's meant to present someone like, Erdogan or Orban or Duterte as sort of like the guardian of sort of, domestic sort of values against sort of this external imposition. So I think disentangling those important things that you mentioned in practice is actually quite difficult because I think they are such powerful sort of forces that can be harnessed. Yeah.
Great. Thank you again to both of you. Congratulations on your excellent contribution. And with that, I would like to conclude this year's annual lecture. One final point, the QR code that you see on the screen is not for questions, it's for the Geopol newsletter. So please sign up. You will have information about upcoming events. We have already an event scheduled for next Tuesday at the University of Oslo, where we will discuss the geopolitical shifts in East Asia and the implications of these shifts for Norway. So we hope we can see you there, if not at other future events. Thank you all for attending, and again, to both of you, Alex and Alex.
Thank you, Ren. Thank you.